starting point for me to enter and maybe try and see if I can join that narrative and give it some meaningful direction. So institutions, how they matter. And I think Doctor took us through the stories about informal institutions, why they matter. So let me just pick up one or two things from where Doctor mentioned and pick up from there. She mentioned about local situs, local festivities and situs, how these are now increasingly being organized by the state and not so much by the community. This is also about death participation in death, how community would help, but now this is becoming a different, it's taking a different direction. And this is to say, but before you go into the formal institutions, with this understanding of informal institutions, the experts have actually looked at it from various angles. But I think what is relevant today is, as the doctor was saying, from a social science perspective, from a sociology perspective, from a psychology perspective. I think if you're looking at why they matter, it's probably straightforward. But how they matter, you have to understand why is it that we do what we do. No? So the psyche of a person, the society, why do we behave the way we behave? And that is basically social practices. So when somebody dies in a village, how everybody comes together to lend support, that's a social practice we've had for a long time. About organizing Tsichu, you feel proud about contributing to your Yukhagi Tsichu, and that's also a social practice. Bhutan, most of us would always read history of Bhutan. It would start off from 1616 when Shabdrung comes in. And I think that is where at least the researched and documented history that we can access right now says 1629, where Shabdrung actually starts building Dukjung in Tangocheri. In a way, that for me, for today's purpose, would be the start of a formal institution, built in Dukjung in 1929. And that is because a society in its informal institutions find pressure to formalize because you're dealing with institutions that are formal in nature outside of yourself. No? So for instance, Shabdrung's case, you had to the north organized, formalized institutions. And when Shabdrung came into Bhutan, he had to organize a formal institution as well. So that's when Pelden Dukjung comes into being. Second, many years down the line, 1907, a lot of changes happened in the country. So 1907, we go into monarchy. That's another wave with formal institution, second wave. And thirdly, a lot of us are living through it. We've participated in it as the 2008 parliamentary democracy change to that. So these institutions have had narratives in the background. So 1629, we know that more. So 1907, also we had conditions and developments that pushed us to adopt formal institutions. Some of these things from there was example, if you look at is, maybe just even go further than that and say, when doctor mentioned about when people in the villages are farming, there's no written rule. So Nagi Lasajo, Pagi Lasajo, that's something Lakodini, no? That's something we do. But then the basis of saying that this is my farmland and that is your farmland and there's a boundary here. Let's say there's a water coming down and then you say there's a hotel that needs drinking water, but you also need water for irrigation. So how do you manage that in the absence of formal rules and written rules and laws? So that would probably, again, come up with property rights. So this gives the farmer the right to say, I farm here, this is my land, that is your land, and there's a boundary here. So that is what I'm trying to say now is these social practices may not call it social practices, but this has a link with formal institutions. Because what formal institutions do is it reinforces and strengthens these social practices they will adopt. Okay, so now when the farmers are farming, they may practice age-old habit of saying, let's work together 3 days. First, my field gets the water, then your field gets the water. There's an understanding is there. But if there is an issue and there is a difference, there is a place you can go and resolve it. So there's a formal process to it. So looking from that point of view, if you looked at the concept as sociology students, or if you go back to your libraries, this is something it might interest you to read further, is on the social practices theory. And this basically what it says is, what is social practice? What does it comprise of? It describes it. And then we need to try and give it, compare it with institutions. then you get a sense of what is informal, what is formal institutions are. So, for example, let's say we already have property law. The land act says this is your satham, so therefore you own it. But then the formal institutions' key response is, so in the many years, we've had people use their intellectual ability to develop property well, for artists who create music, for painters who paint, for people who write books, people who throw ideas out. So for that, this is an extension of a new type of property you have now. And to adopt to that, the institutions come in, and what you now have is called the intellectual property laws. So an extension of property law. So, and this is because there was a group of people who were producing things using their idea. And so this became a social practice. Artists are there, artists who perform, artists who paint, artists who create out of nothing, things out of nothing. And so when that group of people, they have a common purpose, and this is not a one-time thing, they keep doing it as a community. And that also involves a skill, because they're actually using their skill to do that. And aning it together, what it does is, then it sort of pushes for that formalization of their practice. And when you formalize it, then you become an institution. So some people may actually say that institutions have to be structures and offices and structuralist. So you're looking at parliament, you're looking at government, you're looking at, I don't know, BCMD as an institution, okay? But some people might actually say institution can be institution of marriage, can be institution of a family, But these institutions are quite different in the sense you don't see a building or an office or paid employees, So depending on what school of thought you are, look from, people may argue, disargue, but from, I think, as somebody who is just generally sharing what I've observed. So institutions basically are projections of what we do as communities, practices, and that once over time it becomes concrete, then it forms an institution. So therefore you can see, when we first started off as hunters, gatherers, then we eventually become farmers, cultivators. Then we started saying, this is my property, this is where I will do my work, and this is where nobody else can take it. And once that reputation became quite concrete and pertinent, then the idea of private property came in. So I feel that is how, if you look at Bhutanese scenario, so when Shabdrung came in 1629, so Shabdrung, of course, had built in Drukjung, but what does it mean in terms of formal institutions? So he had something called the Tsaik Chembo. So basically, Tsaik Chembo was a code of conduct which says this is what you can do, this is what you shouldn't be doing. Second one is monarchy to 1907. 1907, now once the monarchy comes in, then they come with Chimching Chembo. Chimching Chembo basically tells you what you can do, what you cannot do. And then eventually in 2008, we all know we have Constitution of Bhutan, Satim Chembo. Now, imagine if formal institutions were not there, and as a country you had 20 districts. Who is to feel secure in having a property but somebody snatching it away, or somebody who's very muscular, very powerful, very huge, just bullying somebody who's timid, perhaps physically not as strong, So these four reasons, the reason why I mentioned the Tsaik Chemo, the Tsatim Chemo, and the Chimji Chemo is because this is what it does. And basically what it does is it guides the behavior of our community by saying what you can do, what you cannot do. Mula. So how do formal institutions matter? Practices which, I suppose, extensions of what eventually becomes our value, our etiquette, our norms, and then eventually formalize into rules. So when we talk about, even as let's say, as an organization, we say, let's institute this or let's institutionalize this syllab. What does it mean? It means something that is predictable, something that's transparent, and that's why in the more Taregi modern time, a lot of experts or advisors always be saying good governance is good for the country, good governance is good for the country. And if that is something we all agree, and we have the anti-corruption legislations, we have the penal code, we have the audit authority legislation, and to uphold these legislations, these policies, we have structural offices, like the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Royal Audit Authority. And therefore, in a way, if you look at it, if you look at Parliament, then there's another concept of principal and agents relationship more. So when Doctor mentioned about people and ownership, I think the I think for us, the question really is to think about, consider what is the balance. Do you want to institutionalize, formalize everything to a point where the individual feels alienated in his own surrounding? Uh, but obviously, we know that as an individual, as a community, we can't really do everything. So there has to be a balance. And I think that's the balance what we really need to think about. Um, of course, another thing is once you have these institutions, because as a country, we're saying we don't want corruption. As a society, we don't want corruption. And the projection of that is in having an anti-corruption legislation and then structures to support that. So naturally, now ACC's mandate is to control corruption in the country, and therefore they'll come up with ethics about declaring conflict of interest, about asset declaration. So automatically what they do is these formal institutions also start getting creative and start working on doing these things. For example, if you look at, if I wanted to conduct a surgery on somebody who's in pain right now, I can't because I'm not a doctor. So this is also an outcome of formal institutions that says this is what you can, this is what you cannot do. Okay. So often in news you'll see when institutions break down or they're compromised. For example, a lot of us in our culture, we hear, remember, if you want to go to a government office and get something done, you must know somebody, no? We always start with that. Or we can have a head of a government who will do everything that people want, but not necessarily follow the rule. No? But a lot of us will think he's doing a good thing. Why follow laws? No? Because the laws just make it simply lengthy. Let's say, for example, I don't know, this might be a little controversial. I don't know if BCMD is okay with it, but since I'm speaking, I'm going to speak it anyway. So there are people in quarantine and the country is under lockdown and everybody needs access to cigarettes because there are people who use tobacco. Yeah. And I think people appreciate the fact that, this is to make sure that the craving is addressed. But there's a legislation that says it's illegal and there's been no changes made to in parliament. And that's where law is made. So there's a standing law and there's a government that actually just ignores it and completely ignores it and does what they think is good for the community. Understandable. But that's what you call compromising an institution. And we must remember that institution is not just an office, but it is a collective value projected in the form of an office image, which means when an institution is compromised or hurt or damaged, it is our value that is getting eroded slowly. And that is why you'll find in some countries that when these institutions are eroded or compromised, people come out and protest because they don't just simply see it as parliament being sidelined, but their value, their agreed consensus being derailed, which is a big thing for them. So maybe just to sum it up, Doctor took us through what our informal institutions are, our experiences. And my experience is that formal institutions are nothing but the way of strengthening informal institutions. And informal institutions are basically what we agree to, no? Because if I wanted to create a norm, Sangay Khandu alone cannot do it, no? So in the room today, we are saying, okay, I'm going to speak, you're going to listen. And after once we are done, Riksha will say question, answer, then you're going to ask questions, Meva. And we have all come to this community here with that understanding, the rule of the game, Meva. If there was no rule of game, it would be difficult, no? And therefore, this is what formal institution does. Formal institutions, Doctor was saying, now our culture is changing, no? So similarly, our mindsets are changing, circumstances are changing, and when that changes, our consensus also changes. What was acceptable 10 years ago may not be acceptable today, probably will not be acceptable 20 years from today. And so therefore, institutions must represent that change in our thinking. And if it doesn't, then it's not relevant. And if it's not relevant, like institutions in the past that do not exist today, relevancy is important. It adapts and changes according to need. And with that, I want to say that the offices you see today, if you look back at actually look at them, it's not so much the office, but it's what's the purpose, what they are for, and if they're actually living up to the objectives that these offices that we've created as a consensus amongst ourselves as a society member. So for us, our biggest referent, of course, is the Constitution. It's a constitution where Bhutanese people have collectively agreed to, just like Riksa is going to moderate, I'm going to speak for 15 minutes, doctor spoke before me, and after that we're going to have a Q&A. So there's a role, there's a do and don't. This is where our constitution does. And flowing from the constitution, we have different other laws and policies and rules which come out. And this is all to say that as an individual, I cannot fight corruption. But as a country, we all agree that we need to fight corruption is bad. Then through these various laws, do's and don'ts, agencies sort of personalize or internalize these aspirations that we have. And then the fight continues. Okay, thank you.